Well, the topic of our talk today is poetic justice or cause and consequence. However, before beginning, there are several things that have to be cleared up.
Your mic's not going.
Oh, yes? Yeah, we're going okay now. Can you pick it up? It's on high and talk. And there's no battery light on, so you must be there.
Yeah, she's right.
I made an error yesterday. I said that the man in Nevada that was shot at the firing squad and that went out with a very defiant and cocky attitude, I said his name was Gary Powers. That is not Gary Powers, because Gary Powers was the pilot of the famous U-2 incident. It was Gary Gilmore. Somebody caught it and told me about it after the talk, so I have to make sure I get it on the tape for today. If you catch me making errors, please say something. I need to be told right away. Another thing, I've been thinking about the way things have come out, and to some extent I have given Freud and Jung short shrift in these talks so that they would seem like they were quite negative beings. I don't want to do things like that at all. They're both geniuses and both excellent therapists, and the proof of the pudding is in the eating. And they did things with people that had really hard conditions, and they really helped them. For example, one of the things that Freud says is very much like we said yesterday about carrying a thought all the way through to conclusion. We universalize it as a general principle. But Freud has the same principle, but as usual, he puts it in terms of sex. He says that coitus interruptus is the source of neurosis. And but it's the same principle. Carl Jung says the same thing. And to both of their benefits, since we talked about hypnotism yesterday, both Freud and Jung did practice hypnotism early in their careers. They were both influenced by the French school. I believe that was Charcot and people and company. And both of them, both Freud and Jung, ceased from doing hypnotism. And for exactly the reason that the Rosicrucian Fellowship is not in favor of hypnotism, and that is because it is psychologically brutal. And they both felt the same way. All right, now we're ready to... that I tried to dismiss in one sentence. I don't know why anybody would be so foolish as to try to knock themselves out into a trance, which is virtually what self-hypnotism is. You're driving yourself out of your own vital body. Self-suggestion is a usable thing provided you know what you're doing, but self-hypnosis is entrancing yourself. And there are dangerous things that can happen to it if you people who practice a lot of self-hypnosis actually develop key words for themselves or key concepts for themselves that they can entrance themselves in a moment. And if you happen to be walking across the busy street and apply your key, it's not a very healthy thing. All right, we should get going because it could be long again. Again, if you feel you want or need to leave early, please do so, because I do have a tendency to go on. Rambling, I think, is what it's called. Yesterday, we examined what it is like when you try to consider the path easy street and to take a path to spiritual unfoldment that involves no work and no responsibility. The consequence is usually more work and more responsibility. We saw that the illusion of effortless growth is just that, an illusion. We intimated that there were some pretty great dangers. Today's talk will be totally different, but we have to deal with another illusion. We're dealing with something that everybody knows about, the principle of cause and consequence. And everybody always thinks they know more than they really do. All of us do that. And probably the principle of cause and consequence may be one of the most misunderstood things in the spiritual path because of that. And if it's not the most misunderstood, it may be one of the misused, most greatly misused principles in the spiritual path, because it isn't always bandied about with a lot of compassion. And that being the case, sometimes it in itself is a form of brutalism. My closest friend in the entire world, and the person that I am almost in awe of, is somebody that's 27 years old, and she's a nurse, and she loves, and she just wears herself into a frazzle loving. If I could do anything in these talks that's worthwhile, it's to honor the friends that have been inspiring to me. And she sort of knew the Rosicrucian teaching without having to study the Rosicrucian teaching. And her entire life, even before having ever encountered anything from Max Heindel, was love and service. And when she was a student nurse, for a number of years she was in the rehabilitation ward, which is where they come in after they've had motorcycle accidents. I saw some motorcyclists today on the freeway. I couldn't believe the daring of what they were. And they were hanging out there and putting their foot back up and things like that. And I thought, my goodness, what are they doing? And she's very, very compassionate. And she just said to herself, I can't walk into that ward and say, well, that's their destiny. That isn't enough. On the other hand, she just couldn't go in straightforward because the suffering was so overwhelming. The only thing she could do to bring herself to a pitch to be able to work through the night was she would say to herself, we're all in this together. And some of us need help, and we may not be able to do everything, but we do the best that we can. And that whole conception of we're all in this together, in some circumstances, is she believes in cause and consequence. She believes in rebirth. She has experiences with the invisible helpers where she's given a book and she opens the book up and she sees herself in another incarnation, and she sees how some of the things in this life are a consequence of things she did back then. So it's not like she's hostile or not knowing about these things. She's read all of the Rosicrucian works. She loves Ancient and Modern Initiation, for example. That's one of the illusions that surrounds cause and consequence, that we can just be cold and say it's somebody's destiny. Causes and consequences both live in an environment, and that environment is as important as the action or the event that takes place in that environment. And to strip a cause and consequence of the environment is not a wise thing to do. I hope that medicine, and I hope that pharmaceutical biochemistry learns this lesson. What they do is they go to herbal people, and they learn from herbalism. They try to pump the Indians in the Amazon or the Sherpas in Nepal, because under high altitude, for example, there's a tendency to high blood pressure. And they find that the Sherpas don't have high blood pressure. And the reason for it is because they eat a certain type of yam. So they take the yam back to the laboratory, and they try to find the active agent. And they do, and they put it into a blood pressure medicine. But what they've done is they have stripped away all of the environment, and they just have the active agency. They say it's pure. It's pure. It's not, in a way, it's not pure. You know, we could say we're pure if we don't dive into the world and do something. We can be very pure. We can sit in an ivory tower removed from everything. That's not a real purity, though. Real purity is for the active agency to be in where things are happening. As a consequence, by stripping the environment away from the causal agent, what occurs is all kinds of nasty side effects, because our bodies haven't evolved in such a way that we can deal with pure pharmaceutical reagents. Our bodies have evolved along with the whole environment, and stripping the environment away is a very dangerous thing to do. It's another illusion that surrounds cause and consequence. Everything that happens in the circumstance is important. And surely all of us have heard the statement, well, that was his karma for such and such. We've heard it. Always talking about somebody else. In the first place, the word is not karma. One of my closest chums now comes from India, and he's a mathematician, and we hang out together all the time. He even comes to a Rosicrucian healing prayer group, and he participates thoroughly in it because he realizes that our conception of Christ is very much like his conception of the higher love. Same reality. But he's always, in our little group of friends, he's always saying, you folks don't understand Sanskrit. A lot of the final A's are not pronounced. So the word is karma. It's not karma. In the second place, the term karma is not appropriate to Christian mysticism. There really isn't a term that is right, but the term karma is part of a very strict doctrine. And that doctrine is called the doctrine of avatars. And that doctrine is a very close cause and consequence. Very close. It leaves little room for our conception of grace. As Christian mystics, we know that since the incarnation of the cosmic Christ, who is the focus of the life spirit and that love, into the body of Jesus, there is within destiny the opportunity for the forgiveness of sins. This doesn't void the law. Not at all. Causes and consequences are there. But what is given to you is a light, a love, and a feeling that it's all new, as though it hadn't happened. And with that light comes the ability to understand that you can creatively change what has happened before. We have become creative free agencies to a much greater extent since the ingress of grace into our lives. So a conception that has only the legalistic doctrine of avatars is not what we're looking for. All right. Yes, sir.
So you're saying that the Hindu concept would be more along the lines of the ancient Judaic rather than... Yes.
Yes. Very, very close. In fact, it's much more elaborate. The Judaic the presentation is much more historical. It's very much more codified, whereas the Sanskrit version is much more put forth as a philosophical outlook. ancient Hebrews were not a highly philosophical people, but they were a historical and a legal people, whereas the ancient Hindus were very highly philosophical, speculative types of people, and the different temperaments bring out the same principle in different ways. But I don't want to get too long, because it will do that. It'll get too long. The beings within and behind what we call destiny are creative, but they are also very efficient. You might say God paints more than one picture with one stroke. There are many meanings, there are many sides to any event, any experience, whether it is our little destiny or whether it is the destiny of all mankind. We see this all the time in the study of history. They have now large history books that have many of the theories of history in them, and they keep adding all the time. Two of the things that are most frequently spoken of are the American Civil War and the French Revolution. At first, the simple idea was that the American Civil War was only a matter of freeing the slaves. And then Charles Beard came along, and he gave an economic interpretation. And then Karl Marx came along, and then the psychoanalysts came along. Everybody brings out a different side to the same event. What I'm trying to say is that our lives are very, very rich. If something happens to us, we can say, yes, this was the cause, or this was the reason why this happened to me, and we may be right that that was the reason, but it may not be the only reason, and it may not be the most important reason. I think it's important that when an event happens to us, that we squeeze as much as we can out of it, because life is very precious. We squeeze it like a dish rag to get every bit out of it, so that the dish rag is almost left dry. About 16 years ago, I went through an incident of cancer. And I tried to work with it using alternative therapy, but being very much of a rebel, I even rebelled against the alternative therapy. And so I struggled with the cancer for 4 years. And during that period, my wife, for reasons of her own, left me. She fell in love with someone else. And I had other events happen to me. And it was classic, the astrology of it. You could just follow it right down the line. And I had a large number of events happen to me. And I pondered. You lay in bed. You know, a lot of people lay in hospitals and beds and say, why me? Why is this happening to me? It's all right to do that, but listen for the answer, because there's going to be an answer of why it is you. And I asked, why me? And I began to see that from all the circumstances of my life and from the horoscope, what was going on, I began to understand that in a past life, that I was treacherous. That what happened was that I didn't keep faith with people who trusted me. And to this day, it's excruciatingly painful for me to even miss an appointment. I never want to let anybody down. And I was seeing that the things where people were letting me down was involved with that. And eventually I began to see that my tumor was a consequence not just of having let people down, but that it was a consequence of having let them down and then not forgiven myself. Not accepting grace, because God, Christ, forgave me, but in my pride, I had to down myself. and I had to play God to myself, and I wouldn't forgive myself. And I have never seen it, but I'm almost certain that within that tumor was an entity that was a guilt embodiment, that because I didn't forgive myself. It's interesting, I tried to live by ask whatsoever ye will, but I couldn't ask hard enough, and eventually I had to revert to, if thine eye offend thee, pluck it out, and I lost a half a lung in the situation. How much you can squeeze out and how much your spiritual life grows. Any event that happens to you is a golden opportunity. Eventually I came to understand that the reason that I lost faith was because of desire, and that was why I was born with the horoscope that I have been born with in this life, is to understand desire and to cope with desire. Not a specific desire, but desire itself. All right. But so it isn't just one cause, one effect. What has happened with the evolution and development of material science, which can only deal with one cause for one effect, is that we have come to the understanding that only one cause can produce one effect. Not so. An event in life, a major event in life, can be caused a number of ways. I do a lot of astrology, and I've had to deal with a lot of miscarriages. I think that at least 1 in 10 conceptions ends in a miscarriage. I didn't know this when I first began. And when you don't know something, you look to the books. And I saw all of those things. Yeah, it's Mars or Uranus in the 5th house that leads to a miscarriage, a sudden lurch movement or something like that, and somebody miscarries. However, I started running into miscarriages that didn't work that way. Some of them had to do with the moon square Mars, for example, and it had to do with the pH factor, the acidity in the uterus itself. And then I ran into cases where Mercury was causing miscarriages, and it was due to nervous tension. And then it was Neptune, because taking various medicines can provoke miscarriages. And the coup de grace came when I came up to a chart where I couldn't believe my eyes, but by this point I had been converted. It was Jupiter conjoined Venus. The two most benefic planets in the chart. You would think they could never cause something as horrendous as a miscarriage. They were in Virgo, and they are the two most relaxed planets. Unfortunately, Jupiter is in detriment there, and Venus is in fall. But the way it worked out was that the person was so relaxed with Jupiter and Venus in Virgo that they did not have the requisite muscular tension to be able to carry the fetus all the way to term. So when something happens to somebody, that someone has a miscarriage or something like that, it's never safe to assume that only one thing could have caused that. Astrologically, many things can cause that, and we know that astrologically, each of those many things has a totally different set of meanings behind it. All right. The only way that we can really tell what caused what is by observation, and observation aided by insight. David Hume, the Scotch-British empiricist, has the famous example that he didn't even believe in cause and consequence. He said, cause and consequence is something that we mentally add to events. His famous example is, we see a pool ball come up to another pool ball and meet it, and that both pool balls go off in different directions. He says, we have seen two separate events. We have not seen cause and consequence. And that is true. Only with insight, or only if we can control everything from cause to consequence, can we say that something has caused such and such an event. And boy, what the destiny that we live in, there are a lot of creative free agents in it, divine and otherwise, and we're not that awake of all of our different desires. We're not that awake to all of the intents of the divine within us to say that we know the cause and consequence connection, even if we have clairvoyance. Max Heindel relates the circumstance where he was being taught to read people's past lives, and he would follow this life and follow it into the next, and this life into the next, and he made some connections. And then all of a sudden, it dawned on him from insight that he was not only being trained to follow the same spirit through several incarnations, but it dawned on him that he was being taught the principle that if somebody dies in the battlefield and the body is burned, that in the next life they die in infancy. And he had to see many replications of it amidst other past lives that he was looking over until insight showed him the connection. There is no substitute for spiritual insight, which is the only way that we can really know the truth of matter. And there's another peculiar, in all of these things, I want to talk about destiny pool. I'm getting to the end now, and I can start relaxing. I've been I figure people have come here from all over the world, and I should really give good talks, and I've been a little bit tense. We can follow things further back. Heindel says that if somebody punches somebody in the face, he says that's what caused that was a thought. And the physicist would say, no, somebody's fist caused it. But if you look further, if you look more antecedent into what caused the fist to move, would be the energy, and behind that would be the desire, and behind that would be the thought. But the true motive can only be seen from the spirit. And in between, there are plenty of changes, plenty of places where things could have been changed. As a creative free agency, we can see where we're headed. We can say, no, I don't want to do that. The first level of control is to be able to turn something off. If we find ourselves being involuntarily clairvoyant, we can the first level of development is say no. Then later on, we can say a positive and a controlled yes. This means then that there are all sorts of things, all sorts of beings participating, and even unconsciously, even in our thoughts that we may not be aware of, we're involved in things. When my friend Jimmy and I, when we first started studying the Rosicrucian philosophy, we used to relax and we'd go and play pool. And neither of us were sharps. Neither of us really knew how to control the pool balls. But we realized from studying cause and consequence, there were no accidents. And when you start thinking about slop shots, you know what happens? You hit a ball, and then some ball you never expected over there goes into the pocket. We realized that even though we couldn't control the whole business, we knew there were no accidents. And so it was a really intense psychological situation that we never relaxed while the other person was shooting. We knew that the intensity of consciousness, that at some level we could control whether slop would or wouldn't happen. And so we played destiny pool. Eventually we grew up, or at least I grew up. I haven't seen Jimmy for quite a number of years. But I grew up and realized if I'm going to put that kind of attention, it's going to be not the controlling the slop in pool, but I'm going to be putting much more into not doing harmful things and looking for opportunities to love instead. Oh, boy. This might be very long. We're at a half an hour, and we're only on the beginning, page 2 of the notes. Ooh. A second reason why this talk is likely to be a little bit jumbled is I have realized that there are a lot of illusions about cause and consequence and a lot of misnotions, and I'm rethinking it all right now, and everything is on the table, and I'm trying to understand with a bigger picture. I do something like work on between 200 and 300 horoscopes a year, and I interact with people from most of the major religions and most of the New Agey groups and such like that. And I run into people with all sorts of outlooks, and I'm trying to look behind and see what really is going on. And so like I'm overhauling all of my thought, and I'm starting to develop a new series of talks on cause and consequence, but none of that information will be in this. This will just be as simple as I can do it as far as the simple Rosicrucian outlook on the principle of cause and consequence as it teams up with grace or the influx of love from the life spirit. All right, this is going to be like three little vignettes run together, and it's not going to always unfold one from the other. For the past 7 years, I have been, well, actually for the past 30 years, I've been studying mythology, but I've been giving talks on mythology and modern spiritual philosophy, that is the Rosicrucian philosophy, in which I am trying to look at myths as the language of the gods, that all of the creation in abstract has a story behind it. The life or the spirit behind everything has a story behind it. You know, that's within all of the myths. But I'm an iconoclast by intent. I do not believe there should be mythology anymore. I believe, like Jakob Bema, that we should see the spiritual reality straightforward without anything of the story being lost. It's true that each of our lives is built on the stuff of the stories of many myths, but it's also the history of what we experience. And so I'm trying to do away with the conception of symbolism in favor of straightforward perception. But I want to get at the key principle that we're going to talk about all afternoon by looking first at a Greek cosmogonical myth. According to this myth, the first thing that was created was darkness. And the first thing that darkness created was love. And the first thing that love created was the law. And everything after that is within and under the law. Beautiful, beautiful conception of a formula. The first thing that was created was darkness. From our point of view, that would be the macrocosmic divine spirit, which is ever invisible. No man hath seen the Father but me. The next thing that was created was the life spirit, love with a capital L. And then the first thing that love created was the law, the principles in the realm of ideational thought, abstract thought, where the Holy Spirit is located, and everything that comes into existence in the phenomenal realms comes into existence out of the law. Perfect creative feedback. If you are writing a poem or if you're writing a play, you give it to somebody because you want feedback. You need to know whether it's good or bad or how it affects people. The principle of the law, cause and consequence, is perfect feedback. Now that's how we see the law when we're coming into matter. When we're coming out of matter, as we are now, we're anticipating the time that we're going to be liberated from matter. that is described better in the Bible. Christ Jesus says, how is it? I came not to do away with the law, but to fulfill it. Paul says it even more beautifully and clarifies it in one of the most simple statements that is inspiring to me every time I get caught in destiny by my own stupidity. The end of the law is love. The end of the law is love. That is to say, the law itself isn't sufficient. All those grand principles aren't sufficient. They only point to the purpose, the infinite purpose that is the love of God in the life spirit. All of creation, all of the forms, and even the laws and principles behind them are to express the purpose of love. So, next time you hear somebody say, that was his karm, remember, the end of the law is love. All right, now we're going to tell a big, long story. Since we're not clairvoyants, or some of you might be clairvoyants. I don't know. I'm not. All of this will be like a fairy tale, and you can consider it that. We're going to take from part of the cosmic conception, and we're going to talk about how we came to know the principle of cause and consequence, how we got ourselves into this, and where we are going. The Rosicrucian philosophy claims that there was a time when we as human beings went for the sales pitch of what are called the Lucifer spirits, and we selfishly used the creative energy to perpetuate ourselves. And this is called the fall of humanity. We cast ourselves out of the Garden of Eden, and we put ourselves more and more into a state of blindness, so that it takes us many, many replications of the same dumb mistakes in order to learn. If we had retained insight, if we hadn't been selfish and rebellious, we would have maintained the insight so that we could have learned with very few mistakes and without going so deeply into matter that we identified with matter. According to the Rosicrucian philosophy, when we did enter into matter, our bodies were very, very primitive. They don't say it exactly. Max Heindel describes them as almost dog-like bodies that we had in ancient Lemuria. This is when the Earth was hardening from being thrown off within the solar nebula. And I don't know whether those bodies were indeed like our modern Tarsars or Lemurs. But we were thrown out because we ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And this is going to be our picture of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. What? No, it's not an apple tree. I'm not good at drawing apple trees, and pine trees are much easier. And there's a reason why I chose a pine tree, because the branches on a pine tree come out at levels. And I used to climb the pine tree over there by the cross when I lived here. I used to put up the star at Christmas time every year, and boy, you can really see a distance from up there. But when you look down the pine tree, you can see level after level after level. They spiral, and they come out at right angles, and the next one's over there, and the next one's over there, and all the way down. And we want to look at different levels. So in that far distant period of time called the Lemurian epoch, we came into our physical bodies, which were very primitive and in a way very hard, and we were unconscious. Our whole consciousness was skewed toward materialism and the density that goes with it. What was called good in those days was what produced an awareness of our body and of the external world. Good was anything that produced personal and external awareness. That is, our whole understanding of what was good was what was painful. Whatever was painful waked us up to our body and to our existence. Max Heindel in the Rosicrucian Cosmoconception describes this in such a way. He says that there were like fights to the finish, and people roasted each other on skewers, and there were physical tortures just to see how much one could endure. And the primary principle was to promote pain and to promote will, because the physical world is a reflection of the divine spirit, and when we are here, the resistance of the world wakes us up to will. So whatever was good was what produced pain. Now there are still atavisms of this left in the world. Boxing. It's really a fight to the finish. It's the only sport yet that I know of where the object is the only way you can win is to harm the other person. Even in wrestling, if you can bring a person so that their shoulders touch the ground, that's not meant to harm, except only harm the pride. But in boxing, the only way that you can win is to harm the other person. I have Mars and Libra, and I'm sort of a chicken about pain. I'm almost a coward about pain. We have fire walking, and we have people that lay on beds of nails. And in some practices, like if you go to Dakotas and see a native sun dance, you will see people that do it almost like in Lemuria. There is a ritual that is called taking skin, where they literally take skin off to show their devotion, to show that they care. And some people, they'll use razors, and they will strip a little strip of skin all the way up one arm, across the chest, and down the other. How much are you willing to bear to show your devotion? These are atavisms that go back thousands and thousands of years. But whatever produced pain was good. It brought us into the awareness of the physical world. Some of these things now have just the opposite meaning. Walking on fire or laying on a bed of nails is to show that you can turn pain off. It's sort of like things have to change meaning. Everything in evolution goes that way. When you've gone so far, you close a trapdoor and you force yourself to do something new. At one time, the Earth had a different atmosphere than it did now. It had a non-oxygenated atmosphere. And what happened is there were anaerobic bacteria, and they changed the atmosphere, and they extinctified themselves, except that they can only live underground. Like soil bacteria are anaerobic, but they produced an oxygen-bearing atmosphere so that the waking consciousness that is alchemically represented by the oxidation process, the firing process of oxygen, could take place. When we recapitulate, we've come through this evolution. So by passing through the anaerobic state, we produce the aerobic state. And what we're trying to do in this talk is see how one state leads right into the next state of evolution. This obviously, the sense of pain led to specialized senses of pain. Senses of heat, senses of pressure, senses of light, senses of sound. We developed a nervous system. Oh, did I click off here already? No. It's just about. I must be nervous. I must have a 45-minute suggestion in myself. Talking about auto-suggestion.
You turning your mic on?
Yeah, I'm on, I guess. Or am I? I don't see. Oh, yeah, the light's flickering. So, pain helped us develop an awareness, a vague awareness of a separate personal experience, and it led to the development of a nervous system. Now, from the Rosicrucian point of view, we feel pain in the physical, and we feel it in the etheric, but we feel it more in the desire body. And the consequence of the practice of learning through pain brought us up another level from the physical into the desire world. And the effect, according to the Rosicrucian seers that developed the Rosicrucian philosophy, is that by repeated experiences of pain and understanding things in our personal desire body, this caused say at what region it occurred, but our desire bodies stratified. I suspect that it is probably in the 3 highest regions, which are the soul regions. Now, this stratification, in this, the hierarchies that lead our evolution injected in us through the process of imagination a reflective lower self. That is what we now see as our greatest resistance. The lower self was in late Lemuria and early Atlantis. In that period of history, that period of time, we developed a stratified desire body, and in that stratified desire body was put the lower self, or we were helped to develop it. This is where most of our consciousness is now, is in our lower self. Very rare that we have a transcendental experience and know ourselves as divine beings. Now, this was done for 2 very important reasons that interlock. One is that once we said we take creativity unto ourselves, the gods respected that. When we said yesterday that it is one spirit to one body, the gods respect that. That is, the angels, the archangels, and all the other Elohim, they could no longer lead us around willy-nilly. They had to respect the fact that we were now individuals. We were individuals who had said to the universe, we are our own beings, hands off. However, our psychology was as feeble as our physical body was primitive. And the true spiritual self, the divine, godlike part of our being, could not enter into our consciousness yet, because it still is just beginning. So we needed to have something to take care of us. And so this lower self took care of us. Now, this is really ironic. This is how that principle works. In the same way that anaerobic bacteria extinctified their general presence in the world, the lower self provided for us, as we were awakening, the ability to take care of ourselves. Otherwise, we would have been in trouble. It's sort of like that Johnny Cash song, A Boy Named Sue, where he gives the kid a name Sue so that the kid learns how has to fight because he's got a girl's name. He can take care of himself. Well, the gods gave us a lower self, and that lower self, we took care of ourselves. But now we're starting to come into our true divine being, and what do we have to do? We have to fight against that lower self because it wants to rule for itself because it isn't really what we are. It is a false self. And so, but that's perfectly all right because it is in the internal struggle with ourselves that we become strong and that we become soulful. Internal struggle is the way our soul growth comes about. It's really ironic. But when we have a personal self and when we have pain becoming more and more developed, if somebody loves you and they stroke you, that feels good. It feels pleasurable. And so as we develop more of a personal existence and a selfish lower self to take care of us, what was good for those people was no longer pain. So when we move the consciousness from the physical to the desire world, then what was good was what gave us pleasure. It was an ethic or a morality that was based on pleasure. What gave us, you were rewarded with long years and many fat cattle and all sorts of things like that. And so instead of having rivals that we caused each other pain, we were insecure. And we were no different than a little kid when a little kid says, my dad can beat your dad up. Instead, we said, my God can beat your God. Meaning to say that the different groups of humanity who were rewarded with pleasure and desire, things that were desirable, developed an attitude of enemies, of friends and enemies. And so it became then a religion that was very much involved with you obeyed God because you wanted to be able to defeat your enemies and that you wanted to continue to have the pleasures. There was a certain amount of obedience. The desire body requires obedience. Now, all along, the development of the nervous system, which as the spinal fluid rises, we develop more and more nerves, especially in the cerebrospinal nervous system, became more and more developed. And what happened is that the nervous system develops along the line of the reflecting ether. Especially at first, we always begin with the negative pole. And we began with the negative pole, the reflecting ether, which was memory. So first we became aware of what's out there, and then we learned that something can be more desirable than other things, and then we began to hold things in memory, that this was connected with that, and we in our bodies had a life that was much more like we remembered what we had to do. I don't know how to say it any other way. Along with all of this, eventually we started developing the brain as a vehicle for the concrete mind, the lower mind. And all of this is a really stripped down version that we're getting, because this whole period, the desire period, is associated with Cancer. Going backwards in the zodiac, I'm not saying that this is necessarily involved with the simple process of precession, but many cycles of precession, that there are higher levels of the same principle, that when we went to Gemini, we started developing the brain the nervous system for memory, and the concrete mind. And as we developed that, this all happened with the lungs. And we began to breathe, and we began to come into an open, clear atmosphere so that our perception, we're talking about now starting to rise through and out of Atlantis, so that, Gemini rules the lungs, and Gemini rules all of the bipolar activity of the nervous system. As we saw last week, every movement in the muscles is done by A and not non-A. That when we make any voluntary action, it's an action of symbolic logic, and our whole nervous system is built that way. And so all of our consciousness of breathing, where we alternately oxygenate and carbonate our brain, that we came to the point where the mind could enter in. And when the mind entered in, we went another step up into the region of concrete thought. That is to say, when we put together the memory with meaning, so that we went from the negative pole of the reflecting ether to the positive pole of the reflecting ether, we then began to understand the law of cause and consequence. We saw that there was a logical connection. God was then seen not as somebody who punishes and rewards. God was then seen as somebody logical. We grew up so that we now saw that God was reasonable, that there was understanding, and we had a set of laws. And from these laws, the most basic is the principle of cause and consequence, that there is a logical connection between what you do and what happens to you. So we're climbing the tree of knowledge of good and evil. We're pretty far up there now. And this is the way most of the world is for most people, even to this day. Everybody obeys God's law, which is interpreted differently in different religions, but we have taken that principle of law and have applied it to science, and we have mastered the world, and some people are beginning to step beyond it into the region of abstract thought. That is to say that we understand that it isn't all legalistic. It isn't just a tit for a tat. It isn't an eye for an eye. We begin to understand that there are principles, that there is a higher reason in which our simplistic logic works. And it isn't even a matter of, it isn't just a matter of making a connection that this is connected with that, but we begin to get the idea of things. And with that, the chief idea is the idea of goodness. So, as we grow up from the law of cause and consequence, we begin to understand that there is something good, and that we participate on a higher transcendent level, and when we do so, we have that abstract universal idea. But as we have just seen, the law is not enough. It's not enough. There is behind the law, there is love. We can see that a principle is universal. Everything is tied together in a universal way so that everything works in that oneness by when we look at a principle. However, all of the principles themselves are tied together in truth. That truth is not just a logical thing. It's not even an idea. It is what ties everything together as love. Therefore, we can see exactly as Paul said it, the end of the law is love. I have a bunch of folk statements and Bible quotes. I won't write them out because it would take too long, but I'll read them out. I'll double read them if you want to hear them. Starting at the bottom level, when we're in the physical world, it is, in pain is the birth of knowledge. And this is what we're talking about, knowledge. Not gnosis. Eventually we get to gnosis, but there. When we rise a little higher into the lower desire world, fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. When we rise a little higher yet, who obeys my commands, I will reward. When we rise to the level of concrete thought, as ye sow, so shall ye reap. When we start getting to the region of abstract thought, it becomes, do unto others as you would have others do unto you. When we get higher in the region of abstract thought, good is its own reward. And finally, when we rise into the level of life spirit, when we rise above even ourself, we come to the point where we're told to love thy neighbor as thyself. Love thy neighbor as thyself. And finally, as high as we can go, or at least as I can find in the Bible or folklore, when we rise to the highest level of life spirit love, it is, greater love hath no man than he laid down his life for his friends. Ye are my friends. So it's step by step. The Rosicrucian philosophy claims, though, that as we go limb by limb, we have to have a firm step on the limb that we are on. We have to have a good toehold, or else we get ourselves into trouble. That before we can really reach to the level of life spirit and universal love, we have to be very much in the realm of Jupiter, in the realm of ideational thought. We have to be very principled people. If we aren't, we can get into all kinds of perversions of love if we misapply it. Yes? Yes. In pain is the birth of knowledge. Fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Who obeys my commands, I will reward. As ye sow, so shall ye reap. Do unto others as you would have others do unto you. Good is its own reward. Love thy neighbor as thyself. Greater love hath no man than that he lay down his life for his friends. Yes. All of the, yes, as ye sow is from the New Testament. Do unto others, and good is its own reward are from folklore. Love thy neighbor, and greater love hath no man are both from quotes from Christ. And the general principle that we're using all day, the end of the law is love, is from Paul. Don't ask me where. I'd have to get into the Bible and look it up. And I don't have one of those CD-ROMs yet with the whole Bible on that you can look up one keyword and find it all. I got the Bible on tape, and I've listened to the whole New Testament between Wisconsin and here one year. It was really quite an experience. Yes? You do? I don't have a computer.
my computer.
I'd have to put it on the government computer, and that would not be ethical.
So this is legal to give away.
I know, but I don't have the computer to run it on because I'd have to put it onto a disk on a government computer, and that's not an ethical thing. I'd like it. Officially, I'm hired by the state of Wisconsin, but I'm funded by the Department of Energy, and couldn't you just see instead of doing atomic energy or bomb stuff, I don't work with bomb stuff, not at all. I wouldn't do that. Couldn't you just see it for them to be promoting the Bible on there? But all right, I don't want to. Yes.
Do unto others as you have them do unto you. Is
Yeah.
that concrete thought or
Abstract thought.
And then what about good as your own?
That's higher abstract thought. So what it amounts to, if we want to live more than principled lives, which is what the Rosicrucian cosmoconception tells us to do, that we're not just to be head people and live by principles, we're supposed to live by love. We have to learn to live for the other. We have to learn to live our life for love's sake, and we have to learn to live our lives in a way that we now only usually hear in curse words. We have to do things for the Christ's sake, not our own. All right, you ready for some work now? Now we're going to launch on to the next little vignette, and oh my goodness, we have 20 minutes to go through two major vignettes. Since we're in the transcendental realms, let's look at the law transcendentally. And that is in transcendental abstract thought. God is. In that state of being, spirit knows itself. But also in knowing itself, it knows that within the absolute there is unknown. And the relationship between even the Supreme Being, knowing its existence, and the unknown absolute, that produces a division or a dichotomy. And this dichotomy that originates between what is and what is not but could be is the origin of the internal division. That is, the one takes that relationship to the absolute and internalizes it as an internal division. And this is how all creation is accomplished. That this very origin of everything that is occurs within the internal division of the divine. The internal division of the divine is still within the unity. And that unity which pervades both facets of the one, that unity is what connects cause and consequence. Hence, everything in existence is dichotomized, divided, delineated, but it is all connected. We've been talking all along since we started talking about the nature of the spiritual worlds. We've talked about the other tree, the spirit matter tree. Existing in time and space. And we have said that those are both poles within the one. The way that these very deep things are understood, and it has been for many centuries, to bring people out of the divisiveness of the desire world, has been through mathematics. And 3 mathematical symbols have been used to understand this: the point, the line, and the circle. They are actually all one. Each 3 representations represents part of the same one. A point, whether that point is in time or whether it is in space, is one. That is, it is a position in being. That is the way, for example, that the Pythagoreans described it. It is a locus in space, a position in space, or it is a moment in time. It could be any time, large or small. You can take a moment and expand it as large as you like, or it could be any place. In reality, that point is both large and small. That point is the one. That is the divine. When that one does expand itself through the process of dichotomization, it is called a delineation. That is, it seems to divide itself into 2 points, and when you have 2 points, you have a line. That line represents the description in space of 2-dimensional space. And the simplest way to describe 2-dimensional space is to take your original locus and make a rectilinear Cartesian coordinate, a cross, a simple, balanced cross. This is still the center origin of all, and you might say that in 2-dimensional space, this is the, you have the direction. You can go this way or this way. You can go to the right or to the left. You can go up or you can go down. That is to say that they give you, from relative to the origin, you know where you are when you have 3 points. And you know when you are when you have 3 points. Relative, this point, relative to this and this. I'm not here, I'm not there, I'm here. It's called triangulation. And when you talk about, if you delineate time along a line, you say, this is where I'm going, this is where I was, and this is where I am. 3 points of time. Meaning to say that when you have 2-dimensional space, when you have 1, you have 2, because 1 knows the unknown. And when you have 2, you automatically have 3. And when you have 3, you know who you are, and you have produced the cross in space. These sorts of things, the Rosicrucian Fellowship probably has some of the very best astrology books in print. Some of the very best in print. They are little books by Elman Bacher. There are 9 books called Studies in Astrology. They're very deep. They go into little simple geometric things like this, and they help you to orient yourself into reality. It's very, very beautiful. We're skipping a lot of material here because I don't want to stay too long. All right. So if the line that originally determined the nature of extension of self or delineation of self, if it's the minus sign, that is a horizontal, it represents the horizon. It represents the receptive, like of the earth. On the other hand, if it's vertical, it is the eye. It is the number 1. Who's more important? Who's above? Who's below? Each of these two, when you put them together to form the cross, represents one of the two principles that tie together everything in unity. The principle of the vertical, that is how the divine, going from the unity of spirit into all the differentiations of matter, the distributions into all of the millions and millions of different things, that principle we know as the principle of analogy, which is called the Hermetic axiom. As above, so below. What has gone before in heaven will follow after on earth. Know this and rejoice. On the horizon, or the horizontal, the principle is cause and consequence. That is, we know astrologically, on the left side or the east side of the horoscope is the person. On the other side is the individuality. If you want to know what a man is really like, look at his wife. You find out what he's like inwardly. And there is an equals relationship, the relationship between me and you, or between self and us. When we looked at the color sphere, when we were looking at the desire world, we said that the opposite colors were on the opposite sides of the equator of the color sphere, and that they perfectly balanced each other out, and that every color was equal to every other color. They were bound by a principle of cause or consequence. So what we're saying, on every limb of the tree of good and evil, there is an equals relationship. But that each limb supersedes as we go into the as above, so below. Each of these delineations can be seen as a ray or a radius, which is where our word radius comes from. It's from like a sun ray, that when the one expands itself and extends the moment, the one little point, out to the extent of the cosmos, those are rays. And so this point is the same as the circle. Actually, you can draw a circle if you have a line. You just fasten one place and have it be your origin. You take a piece of string or the pencil and you have the circle. So when we put the cross in the circle and say that this is the womb of the cosmos, we then have the ancient symbol that Plato talks about, that the world soul is crucified. That is to say that the principles on which everything is hung, the cross on which everything is hung, is on the Hermetic axiom and on the principle of cause and consequence. In another way, the animal group spirits are on the horizontal. On the lower limb of the cross are the plant group spirits looking upward, and on the vertical, looking very far upward, are the humans, so that the world soul is crucified in the circle. This was a very sacred symbol. It's shown in the hell of the Greek mythology as Ixion's wheel. In fact, the ancient initiates in Egypt used to be crucified on a wheel, and they turned like that, and they realized that their life was part of the entire revolution of all things. So what we're saying is that in the principle of consequence, everything is tied together. And since what we belong to, since this is a womb of the Spirit's creation, this means that for the divine, everything within the whole cycle, within the whole womb of being, everything within the divine has perfect feedback. This is the law of service that we talked about the first day. The one has the dream of the entire creation, and it radiates that dream out, and all of the beings that become within that dream, from the most dense atom in matter all the way up to the highest divinities, as they unfolded and discovered for themselves, they radiated back. Perfect cosmic feedback. If we think that the end of the law is love, everything we do when something happens to us, whether it's an illness or we get a break to rise higher in our job, or we walk down the street and see a bird, it's perfect feedback. Everything in the cosmos is perfect feedback. God needs it as much as we do. And that's, in abstract, you can see then that everything is unified. Hey, we got a reasonable chance of getting quite a few points in here. We may only be 5 minutes late. That's unbelievable. The last part of the talk is a number of restatements. This is a repetitive talk. You know, cause and consequence, cause and consequence. It's going to sound like laying down the law, but I have a number of precepts of stating things all over again in different ways that I find to be helpful to me, that I'm using for my own thought in coming to understand the principle of cause and consequence better. As we've just seen, existence of itself necessitates judgment. There cannot be an experience but that in the process of existing, the result of that experience, we form judgments about the nature of reality, about the nature of the unknown, and make it known. There is nothing that is not involved in the whole of creativity. From our most gross actions, or even laws of physics, action and reaction, that's part of the same principle. Newton had it right. It was just, it's a small, Newton's is as universal as it was small relative to what transpires in the entire cosmos. Corollary to this is that from the universal down to the most gross, there are many such circles or cycles. And that is to say, if we are in a fight with someone, you know, the more rare and the more universal, the longer the cycle and the more meaningful. Whereas the more personal and the more physical, the shorter the cycle and the less meaningful. It's sort of like what happens. When we used to fight person to person. And then we graduated to throwing stones and shooting arrows. And now we shoot intercontinental ballistic missiles that the distance in time and the distance in space is longer. Some of our causes take thousands of years to come back to us. When the chickens come home to roost, they don't even look like when they went out. So another way of looking at this, or another principle, is everything in my experience is a reflection of the divine and my participation in it. Meaning to say, what motivation could we have that's higher than to be part of the divine creation altogether? What it means, we see it all the time when we work with astrology, it means that our little lives are perfectly connected to the big life of the cosmos. And our little things are affecting the planetary spirits as much as the planetary spirits are affecting us. It means that we are part of the builders. We are indeed builders of the cosmos. Everything that happens to me is just, is good, is meaningful, and it represents a creative opportunity. Manure is a great creative opportunity. Some people value it. Let the Leos have the gold. The Scorpios want the manure because it's fertilizer. You can't, Midas showed that you can't eat gold. But you know what I'm trying, the point I'm trying to make, that everything has some good end to it. If we deny that there is anything good in what happens to us, we're creating and we're perpetuating an illusion. If we want to have a cause with no consequence, that's an impossibility. That's like trying to, can you say something that is meaningless? Try it. You can't say something that is meaningless. And a psychiatrist, if you even came up with gibberish, a good psychiatrist could find a lot of meaning in it. There's much more meaning than we would ever suspect. It's a great illusion to try to have a cause without a consequence. If you think about it, that's what birth control is. You want to play with that energy and put out that enormous cause without letting it have its consequence. That's a really interesting thing. I got so many things here I'm going to start skipping. Next precept is when we know the law, that gives us freedom. But there is a paradox, and that paradox we've spoken of before. To know the law, we have to be above it from the level of Christ. But the paradox is that from the level of Christ, it needs liberation by going into the law. We liberate the healing force from the life spirit by bringing it into use. The best way is to see ourselves suspended, that we're free. We're free first to choose between alternatives, and eventually we have the freedom to create. The law says that everything can be creative. I don't know how to say it any other way. It's enough, I guess. My character is a consequence of my deeds. My destiny, what I am, what I see, is a product of what I have done and what I have not done. Everything that all right, I guess that's enough of it in itself. There is at least one practical, moral, spiritual lesson in every event in life. Probably the deeper the event, the more meaningful the lesson. There are probably many meanings to each event that happens. Everything that happens to me is also to the end of general awakening. Because that's why the creation is there. God is waking up just like we're waking up to more and more possibility within the unknown, within the absolute. In a way, what we started with at the bottom of the tree of knowledge and good and evil, we're still doing that now. We're waking up. We don't have to take skin or be roasted on a spit, but we're still waking up. We always want light, more light. We want to keep on waking up, and everything that happens to us has as part of its general end the waking up. Acceptance and full attention of experience is of supreme importance. We can't just rationalize it. We just can't say that this isn't important to me. Accept what is in us, experience it, and then create. It's all part of a cosmic creation. We always have the opportunity, because time is involved when we put a cause out. By the time it comes back to us, we have the opportunity to create and make something new with it It's something like Superman playing ping pong with himself. He can spike on both ends of the table. Things come back to us. One that I have been finding exceedingly important is to play the law is to be played by the law. That is, we fall into the law in the lowest sense if we try to make a whole bunch of good destiny for ourselves. It's like fishing for compliments. Fishing for compliments isn't a way to attract people to you. That's a way to repulse people. You're asserting yourself and say, look at me, here I am. Something like that. That's not the way it is. And corollary to this, that is, to play the law is to be played by the law. If we think about it, a backlog of good destiny is as weighted and onerous as a backlog of bad destiny. Any time that what is available to us is not immediately available to us, we're not living in the moment. Initiation is exactly the Rosicrucian cosmoconception. In initiation, you leave your body and you see your life backwards and you go through as much purgatory from this and past lives as you can handle. As much as you can handle. And there are beings there that say to you, at least this is the way Heindel says it, you're commanded to give the love of Christ to what comes to you. That means you're creatively transform it, because in order to do the initiatory work, you have to have the soul power. And that soul power has to be available to you. And the only way you can do that is to release it from what you have tied up in destiny. So if you think that you're going to be a miser and store up all this good destiny, that's a foolish mistake. You're just weighing yourself down. That's almost like a preacher, my goodness. All misdeeds can be turned to the good. I've been watching the Olympics a little bit at night, and it's really great to see the kids, when they make a mistake, they don't give up. They keep their poise, because they realize that if they start thinking about, wow, I've made a mistake, it keeps them from being able to. The young man that had that thing with the rings where his hand went through the ring, yesterday he won a gold medal because he didn't allow himself to think that he was shot because he did something wrong or because he did something bad. Everything can be turned to the good. And finally, we say the final principle, the end of the law is love. Now, earlier we said that a cycle or a circle is just another form of a point. It's equally punctilious. On Tuesday, we talked about half of a great cycle, what happens after we die. Tomorrow, we're going to finish up by talking about what happens when we come to rebirth.